In this video, I'll be making a super solid plywood workbench. Design of this workbench took inspiration from Paul Seller's Plywood Workbench and Jay Bates' Roubo style workbench, but I think my design has a few advantages over both of them. Well, first, the whole workbench is made entirely out of 18mm birch plywood. Without using solid wood means I can skip the tedious milling process, and since the plywood is relatively stable, I don't need to worry about the top becoming not flat with seasonal changes. And second, since all the components are made out of laminated plywood, it's easier to create strong mortise and tenon joints without using a router or any drilling machines. I choose the Roubo style instead of the traditional English joiner's bench with a large apron in the front, meaning I can fit a cabinet underneath the empty space below the top. I think it's really important for a small workshop where good use of space is the key. If all these sounds good, please stick around and see how I built this workbench. I started by making the leg frames. First I cut out a manageable piece from a full sheet of plywood, and then I cut them into strips on the table saw. To build the leg frame, I first laminated the outer two layers of the plywood strips. I applied a generous amount of glue and used some brad nails to temporarily fix them together before clamping them up. For the upper and lower stretchers, I used the same method. Since they are only made out of 3 layers of plywood, I assembled them all in one go. Then I started building the inner 2 layers of the legs. I was aware that there will be a cutout for the mortises for these 2 layers, so I didn't put any glue in that area. However, I still made a mistake here, which I'll show you later. Now I can glue up the inner 2 layers with the outer 2 pieces. There will always be some shift in the plywood when you are gluing up so many layers, So I clean up the faces with the hand plane and make sure that it's square to the other faces. Well, you can see how wobbly my current workbench is when I'm planing the board. That's one of the reasons why I decided to build a solid bench. Now I can cut out this section where there will be a mortise for the rails. I set up a stop block on my crosscut sled and made the cut. But since I didn't apply any glue in the cutout section, so it should be quite easy to chisel it out. But this is certainly the case for one of the layers, but it's not the case for the other one. This is when I realized I applied or not applied the glue at the wrong layer. But that's okay, I went back to the crosscut sled and cut out the waste area and cleaned up with a chisel. Finally, I can glue up the last two layers to complete the 4 legs. As before, I clean up the faces of the glued up legs with the hand plane, while checking that they're square to the other faces. To join the legs with these stretchers, I'm going to use some dominoes. Here I'm clamping them in the final position and mark out the locations for the dominoes. If you don't have a domino machine, you can probably use half lap joint here, just like what Jay Bates did in his workbench. Before the test assembly, I gave all the dominoes a light sanding, just to make it easier to take them out of the mortises. Now that I know everything is square in the test assembly, I can now move on to gluing up the two leg frames. With the leg frames built, I can now focus on making the front and back rails. As before, I cut out an oversized panel with the track saw, and then cut it into strips on the table saw. You probably know the drills now. The rails are glued, nailed, and clamped. Before assembling the rails, I'm going to add some small chamfer details on the protruding tenants. After dry assembly, making sure everything is square and level, I can now move on to glue up the rails to the leg frames. After the glue is dried, I came back and reinforced the joint with some dowels. I guess structurally speaking it's not really needed here. But it does make it look like a drawable Morton's tenant, which is quite nice detail if you ask me. For the plywood strips for top, since they are quite long and awkward to maneuver on the table saw, I thought I would give it a try for this parallel guide I bought from benchstock.co.uk. You can put this little jig on your track, and underneath the track there are these aluminium protrusion which you can butt up to the edge of your board. Well, this ensures accurate and repeatable cuts, especially if you're going to make a lot of strip cuts like I do, or at least in theory. So the first cut looks quite good, giving me consistent width across the length. However, as I went on cutting more strips, something clearly went wrong. Some part of the strip can be a few millimeters off. Well, this is my first time using the parallel guide, so I wasn't sure if there's something wrong with my technique. Maybe I was pushing the track too hard against the board. Maybe there was some twist in the board leading to these errors. But I couldn't really pinpoint what the problem was. Well, as a result, I wasted a lot of strips and had to do a lot of cleanup when the top is glued up together. To glue up the tops, I glued the outer 4 layers first. As before, they are glued, nailed and clamped. Only this time I correctly figured out which layer should not be put any glue for the cutout section. And then mark out the cutout section for the tenants. Then I cut them out with my Japanese handsaw. Now you can see the waste can be chiseled out quite easily. After a test fit, which looks quite good, you can then move on to gluing up the rest of the layers. To make sure the top sits flat on the leg frame, I need to flatten the section where the top sits on the stretchers. There's no need to flatten the whole bottom, only the area where it touches the leg frame is fine. To install the worktop, I apply some glue in the mortises and then hammered it into the tenants. Now let's focus on the most important part of this build, flattening the top of the workbench. I was feeling a bit adventurous and decided to do this only using hand planes. Spoiler alert, I didn't get it perfectly flat using this method. Well, although it's not a complete success, at least I got more confident using the hand plane and had a better feeling of how much material each plane stroke takes. So I followed the advice from J. Bates by first marking out the high spots with the pencil. Then I took them out with the hand plane and repeat this process a couple of times. There's really not too many techniques in this method other than just a lot of variable grease. Also, rubbing some candle wax on your plane sole really makes the plane glide much more easily. In the end, I got most of the top flat, but you can see there's a very slight dip, about 1 mm in the center. So to get the top perfectly flat, I still need to take out a few millimeters on the two long edges of the top, which is quite a lot of work, so I decided to use the power tool method. I built a router sled using Wood Whisperer's method, link in the description below. I have to say this takes much less time and I'm very happy with the result. The router bit left these ridges on the top, but it's really not as pronounced as it looks on the camera. Since the router bit is round, they also left these triangle shapes on the edges, but it can be taken out quite easily with the hand plane. To trim the end of the worktop flush, I ran the track saw to establish a straight edge and then finished off with the hand plane. Then I gave everything a quick sanding with 120-grit sandpaper except for the worktop. Then fitted the shelf at the bottom. For the finish, I applied 2 coats of water-based varnish for the leg frames only. And finally, I added these retractable workbench casters. I also added the Veritas twin screw vise as my front vise. Since this video is already quite long, I'm going to put that into another video. In the future, I also plan to build a cabinet underneath and add some dog holes for the tail vise, so stay tuned if you want to see more build of this workbench.